Hello, I'm Erik Dahl. Ever since the pandemic began, I wanted to understand how it could have happened. How is it possible that the United States and the rest of the world seems to have been taken by surprise by a threat that we've been warned about for years by public health agencies, intelligence officials, and others? How is it that we didn't listen to the warnings? It's important for us to understand how this happened, first, so that we can do a better job of fighting the pandemic today when thousands continue to die every day. But more important, we need to learn how to prevent the next crisis, because the next pandemic could be an even worse one, or we could face another even worse kind of crisis sometime in the future. When I began looking at this, I realized that this pandemic has been a global intelligence failure, and it's a failure that's very similar to past major intelligence failures, such as 9/11 and Pearl Harbor. In each case, we've seen three key factors at work that have prevented warnings from being used to prevent disaster. The first factor is strategic warning. These are big picture, long-term warnings of threats that might come in the future. They can come from war games, from intelligence agencies, from experts. These sorts of threats are very impressive, but they usually are not very helpful in preventing disaster from happening. Let's look at how that has worked in the cases we're looking at here. In 9/11, for instance, we saw strategic warnings ahead of time from experts such as Richard Clarke, the former White House counterterrorism advisor. And we saw warnings from academic studies that warned that Al-Qaeda was preparing to use airplanes as bombs. It might use them against the White House, or even use them against the World Trade Center in New York. Before the pandemic, Bill Gates was sort of in the Richard Clarke role. He's been warning the world for years about the threat of a global pandemic. And just in the months before the outbreak began in China in late 2019, we saw high-profile warnings from blue ribbon commissions, from war games such as in New York and elsewhere, warning about the threat. So what went wrong? Well, largely it's because decision makers get lots of these kinds of big picture warnings all the time. For instance, when the Director of National Intelligence warned about a global pandemic in early 2019, he also warned about the threat from cyber, from great power competition, from global warming and global climate change, and from many other kinds of threats. That leads to the second factor. These are tactical intelligence warnings about the actual threat itself. These are the sorts of warnings that can become actionable intelligence if they get to decision makers in time and they take action on them. These are tactical warnings. For instance, before 9/11, we all remember now learning about that famous President's Daily Brief, the PDB, that warned President Bush that Al-Qaeda wanted to attack within the United States. And we now know that there were so many warnings during the summer of 2001 that the 9/11 Commission called it the summer of threat. There were lots of tactical warnings before 9/11. In the same way, there were lots of warnings in the early days of the pandemic before it went global. In late December and early January, there were warnings from intelligence agencies, and more importantly, from disease surveillance systems, including those that used artificial intelligence to scan the web and social media to detect outbreaks and track the outbreak as it developed. So what went wrong here? Well, before 9/11, the problem was that those tactical warnings didn't provide enough information to help get inside the Al-Qaeda plot. And before the pandemic went global, the information that we had was too little too late. Disease surveillance systems such as contact tracing tended, especially in the United States, to not be used well enough and strong enough, too little too late. And the third key factor is unreceptive decision makers. It's a truism in the intelligence business that intelligence and warning are of absolutely no value if they don't get to someone who's willing to listen to it. You can leave as many playbooks for the next administration as you might want, but if they don't listen, they're not worth the PowerPoint that they're constructed on. We saw before 9/11 a lot of unreceptivity with President Bush and his key advisors, but also in places where you would expect they would be receptive, such as the Federal Aviation Administration. Even FAA leaders didn't listen to the warnings that they got about the threat from aircraft from their own intelligence officials. And before 9/11, or before the pandemic, we certainly saw a lack of receptivity. Donald Trump will go down in history as probably one of the least receptive toward intelligence of any American president in recent days. But even when he got warnings from people he seemed to trust, like the leader of China, that the virus was deadly, he didn't take swift and effective action. But what does that mean? I think it's too simple to lay the blame for the pandemic solely on Donald Trump. His lack of receptivity doesn't explain the lack of swift and effective action in many countries around the world, or the lack of effective action in many communities and states around the United States, where the most important public health decisions are actually made at the local level. What we seem to have seen with the pandemic is a repeat of a familiar pattern of strategic warnings that are just not effective in preventing disaster, of tactical warnings that are too little too late, and of decision makers who are not receptive to the warnings that they do receive. Well, what can we do about this? What are the lessons? The first lesson is actually there is some good news. From what we know so far, at least, about the actions of the official American intelligence community, the agencies of the American intelligence community did a pretty good job of sharing the information they had. They just didn't have enough information to go on. There wasn't enough information. The intel community was really following the news rather than making intelligence. The second lesson is that one of the important intelligence failures from 9/11 came after 9/11. We need to remember that after 9/11, we gave our intelligence community almost unfettered powers to monitor American citizens. It didn't do any good. And it just showed that we need to remember that domestic surveillance systems need to have vigorous oversight. And finally, what do? First, we need to do a much better job of emphasizing health within the formal agencies of the American intelligence community. Second, we need to provide a lot more support for disease surveillance and health intelligence. And the most important is we need to take a global approach, because a global intelligence failure can only be addressed by taking a global approach to the problem. If we don't do more now, if we don't do more to listen to the warnings next time, we may face an even greater crisis next time. Bill Gates and other experts have warned about the next pandemic, or we might face an even worse kind of crisis from some other cause. We need to make sure that the next time when the warnings come, they will be heeded.